Well, I'm really excited about this closing plenary, not because it is the closing plenary to cap off the Global Ethics Summit, but we have a really impressive group of people here and organizations that we've worked with all around the world, quite frankly. So this next session on organizational justice will conclude a Global Ethics Summit. I'd like to invite the panel members up right now with ManpowerGroup, Infosys, Accenture, and Coca-Cola. And of course, always my favorite person in the moderator chair, no offense to all those that have moderated this week, including myself, but Erica Salmon Byrne, my good colleague, one of the best in the business. So I will turn things over to her, and good luck, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And for those of you who have listened to me over the course of the last day, you've heard my voice slowly degrade. So I'm really hoping that it gets me through the next hour. I've already warned the AV guys that they have to turn my mic up really high because this is about as loud as I can talk right now. So we have a fantastic panel that is poised to discuss one of my favorite topics. I'm not going to waste any of our valuable time going through bios because everybody's available to find everywhere, but we have Joe from Coca-Cola, Patrick from Accenture, Indrapreet from Infosys, and Richard from Manpower, and we are going to dive into, as I mentioned, one of my very favorite topics. I know that a lot of you may have to bolt at some point during the panel to catch planes, so I've already warned my mic running colleagues. I'm going to take questions throughout. So if at any point any of you guys have a question, I'll try to keep an eye out for hands, but go ahead and hop up, wave at me if I'm not paying attention, and we're happy to follow you all down whatever rabbit hole you'd like to go down. So, Richard, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to start with something that we talked about on the prep call, which is unpacking this idea of organizational justice. What does it mean? How does it interplay with fairness? And how do you think about that in the corporate context?
So to me, it encompasses three things. And there's an old saying about where you stand depends on where you sit.
Yep.
So I'm going to look at this from a couple different perspectives. I would say at the outset that it encompasses fairness in how the organization handles rewards such as compensation. Are they based on merit? Are they based on assessment and performance? Or are they based on something else, cronyism, who you know in the organization? So that's the first element of fairness. Is it fair in terms of there not being any bias, gender bias, racial bias, other types of bias? And of course, in terms of that, we're seeing a lot of organizations become much more transparent in what they disclose. Gender pay is a perfect example of this. In some parts of the world, it's being mandated by regulatory changes. Elsewhere, companies are becoming more transparent out of choice. And I think that's an opportunity. It also presents a question whether the cultural values of the organization around rewards are actually backed up by the data. Promotions is another aspect of rewards. Are promotions being handled fairly? Does the notion of promotion change as you go from more junior to mid-level to senior management? Are the same parameters or the same factors considered? Or do you have a situation where management doesn't quite walk the talk?
Right.
The flip side of rewards would probably be discipline or downside scenarios. And there, of course, we'll have a lot to talk about on the panel. Since this is a conference on ethics and compliance, of course, all of us have situations where there are compliance-related issues and some type of action needs to be taken. And to me, how it's handled in the organization, the perception of how discipline is handled is critically important. Is there one set of rules that applies to everybody? Or again, does it matter depending on who you are? Even if there is one set of rules and they're applied fairly, probably the perception of how they're applied becomes critically important to your employee base. Is there trust in how the organization handles matters that might lead to disciplinary action? And then finally, for me, as a GC, in addition to the notions of transparency and fairness, I have an interest in what we might call the process around action or disciplinary action. I'm a little hesitant to use the phrase due process, but I'd want to make sure that processes are consistent, that they're as consistent as they can be in a global organization, that an allegation of wrongdoing is handled with an appropriate investigation that's consistently applied, regardless of who the individual is. And that may not completely square with how employees see it, but to me there's an important long-term value in having the organization handle things fairly, whether it's done internally or with external advice.
Interpreet, I know one of the things that Infosys is doing right now is looking at expansion outside of sort of your core markets. And that brings with it its own set of challenges from, sort of Richard's formulation of how do we think about promotion decisions, how do we think about who gets the next opportunities. How are you all approaching this question of, sort of how do we structurally set it up so that the activities we're engaging in have that sense of organizational justice?
So I think, I completely agree with what Richard said, and perception is such a large part of this.
Yes.
But it's also communication, because many of us, in fact, maybe most of us are sitting and looking at this from the inside out, right? And people who are looking at it, who are in the field offices or in the markets, get a very different sense of it. So I think communication becomes key, and you're right, our business model is changing in that when this industry first started, the India heritage companies, if you will, came into Western markets, and the workforce was largely people who came with them on work visas, and there was a lot of mobility of people. And now Infosys, for example, has said that we're going to hire locally. And so how do we as an organization then adapt to this changing workforce, right? And it's changing in all kinds of aspects. It's gender, it's ethnic diversity, it's age group. And how do you communicate with them? The model sort of started off being, let's take the India policies, make sure it's compliant with local laws. So it was India plus legal compliance, and that doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore because you're living in a different world. That was 20, 25 years ago. And now you've got to adapt to what makes cultural sense in a country, which may be way beyond what the law requires. And it could be something as simple as benefits, how leave is looked at, all of that. And how is all of that getting communicated? I think that's sort of key to this whole process as well. We all want to do things fairly. Our policies, processes are all laid out that way. But oftentimes we are constrained either by legislation, privacy considerations, et cetera, as to what you can say to your larger employee pool who's looking at this and wondering, this is an issue, how did it get addressed? And oftentimes you cannot do that, right? You don't share outcomes. So how do you handle disclosures? That's, I think, another big challenge, and how do you adapt it to different geographies?
Yeah, and one of the things that we see in the data sets that we've collected is more and more companies have figured out how to tell those stories, and how to do so in a way that doesn't give their employment lawyers heartburn in various jurisdictions, but has the opportunity to have that communication channel that opens up with employees to say, this is the issue that came up. Yes, it really can happen here. Here's how it happened. And here's what we did. And that here's what we did piece becomes a part of that communication channel, right? Because it gives you the opportunity to have a conversation that is as much about the range of options available to the company, that don't necessarily end with somebody being walked out in handcuffs. That's not the perp walk is not the only possible outcome.
That's right.
Joe, one of the things we talked about in the course of the prep conversation was, and I want to hear from Joe on this, and then Patrick, I'll ask you to chime in as well, is that challenge of reaching employees, right? You guys, Coke has a wide variety of employees in a wide variety of settings and geographies, and how do you think about this issue of communication with employees around some of those pivot points that Richard mentioned, given the breadth of your workforce?
Yeah, it's always a challenge, and I think you've hit on a great point. But there's a little bit of a build. Here's what we do, or here's what we did, and that's somewhat easy to explain. We all have codes of business conduct, or we have processes or procedures, and we put that out there. So employees have some expectation of what the rules are and what is appropriate conduct and what is not appropriate conduct. What I've found is the hard part is this is how we did. what we did, and this is why we did what we did, and to get people to buy in and to understand that there may be different outcomes that look, or outcomes may look completely different, or they may look completely the same, but because we can't give you full information about what happened to an individual that violated the code or a company policy, you don't have complete information. So it really, we try to get a basis of trust through transparency and through reporting, and everybody has opportunities and challenges. We are no different, but we continue to try to determine what's the balance of putting out information that is the most transparent that you can be, and it explains the process, and it explains how the process works, and then it explains why these results were obtained, and then how they impacted certain individuals without violating somebody's privacy or unduly creating humiliation or emotional distress or being counterproductive and breaking down the trust bond. So that's what we try to do, is to communicate with an eye toward understanding and building trust, because if you have trust in how we perform our process and the system, then you'll report things, then you'll be there won't be a chilling effect. You won't be as afraid of retaliation. And interestingly enough, most of our investigations they exonerate people who are being investigated, for lack of a better word, right? It's obviously not a criminal investigation, but about 55 to 60% of the time, there is no code or policy violation. It's a misunderstanding, or it was a report that was made, and we go through those reports. So, you want to get that word out, because I think, again, that demonstrates the system works. You get a fair investigation. We take a look at things. It's not, if I file a complaint against somebody, then, that's it.
Right.
It's a game over. They're not going to look any further.
And so do you then share some of your substantiation rates and days to close and things like that?
We do. We probably share more on a statistical basis than we do on an individual basis, but the business clients are constantly asking me whenever I meet with them, can we publish like the list of, every year or every month of, who was guilty of a code violation and what happened to them, and we can take their name out, and they always know of some business somewhere that they post the list of people who were terminated on the door of the headquarters or whatever. So we don't do that, but we'll anonymize stories, and every once we'll put them in some of our publications, and especially if it's something that is going to have some precedential effect, right? You really don't have to tell the story of a person who, cheated on their expense account and got caught and a bad thing happened. But, anything that may be systemic or interaction with a government or generate legal liability for the company, those are things that we like to use as learning examples and put them out there.
Got it. That makes sense. Patrick, I know this is something, the communication piece in particular, is something that you guys have been working very hard on. And for anybody in the room who hasn't seen it, the chatbot that Accenture has built is one of my favorite examples of using technology in the code context. It's even though you have people trying to break the bot, you still get a tremendous amount of interesting information from it. So can you talk a little bit about how you've been trying to reach employees to build on Joe's point about building trust in the process?
Sure. So the chatbot is one way. That is just thinking about the workforce that we've got, full of many millennial people. So how do they receive and want to use information? And very often part of the idea of the chatbot was that people don't read anything anymore. Someone was talking about emails yesterday, and no one's reading emails, so everyone's using text or WhatsApp and chat as a way of receiving information. So that was some of the thinking about the bot. And this is not about the bot, but that's a separate discussion. But I think one thing to pick up on something that Joe said about the how and the what.
Yeah.
I know this is not a Me Too panel, but just to illustrate the point.
Everything's a Me Too panel these days.
So last year we decided to, because we've because our CHRO and GC and board have been so committed around inclusion and diversity and our goal, our very aggressive goals of wanting gender parity in the workforce, we thought it was very appropriate to come out with some training around what is the Accenture view here, what is the gold standard across all the different offices that our people should expect. So they had a conversation that was recorded and broadcast, and it was required training for everybody. And that we got a lot of positive feedback about that, which was good. We got a little bit of negative feedback, which was, why are you telling me this? I know this already. Why are you coming back to me to talk about this? Okay, well, it's important. But then we followed that up with some more training later in the year, where we got some more scenarios, picking up on the theme of we can't do public hangings necessarily, but we can use the stories. So we had some actors in videos again. But then what we did was to get two of our real-life investigators to talk through what a person can expect, how we will treat an investigation, how often they should be expecting to be hearing from the investigators, what are some of the principles we apply as well, so that they could see we take it very seriously as well.
So how did you do, like, was that a video conversation
That was a
with the
video
investigators, and then you distributed that to all of your employees worldwide? Do any of the three of you do anything similar with, sort of the investigator's viewpoint?
Well, we don't. And in the interest of full disclosure, Patrick and I used to work together at Accenture, and we're old friends. And there's a lot I admire about Accenture, and I especially admire the budget Patrick has for this. So these are best practices for sure, and I'm taking notes, and eventually we'll get there. I'm a little more hesitant on some of the how do we do the investigation transparency, and there are multiple reasons for that. I realize transparency in general is a virtue, but I think it has to be handled carefully. And I'm reluctant to create a one-size-fits-all template where employees might have an expectation that this is how the investigation is going to be conducted. Yes, we're committed to doing it fairly. We're committed to having external resources where there might be an internal conflict. But the nature of the investigation is likely to depend to some degree on what the early rounds of it discover, what the facts and circumstances are of the incident. So I'd be hesitant to have a prescribed set of rules that are too detailed on how we conduct them.
So Patrick, can you talk a little bit more about sort of how your investigators talked about what they do?
Yeah, so I don't think they were being prescriptive in the sense of this is the path that we should always follow, but it was more speaking to the individual to say, if you spoke up, then this is what you can expect. Someone from our jointly trained team will be getting in touch with you. The investigation will be conducted in a confidential way. The fact that the review of the investigations and the outcomes ultimately roll up to me and the head of employee relations globally, so we get that global consistency as well. But it was communicating some of those higher level principles.
And I think, one of the things that we see, as many of you in the room know, we do a lot of work helping companies measure culture, and organizational justice, employee perceptions of organizational justice is often the worst performing pillar for an organization, tied with pressure to compromise company standards to achieve business objectives. And very often that comes down to perceptions of the comments and the attitudes of managers, particularly mid-level or lower level managers inside the organization, where an employee might feel like, the company took one path from a disciplinary perspective, but then my manager started treating me differently. Or, a situation where an employee is feeling pressure to compromise standards because of the fact that their manager is making comments about hit the number, hit the number, hit the number, hit the number, and they're assuming that the but don't break the law part is understood, which in many cases, depending on the phrasing, it may not be. So, Indrapreet, I'm curious, as you guys think about your managers in particular, and let's be honest, very often when we are promoted to be managers, it's not because we know how to manage, it's because we were good at the job we were doing before. How do you guys think about preparing managers to effectively address the perpetual complaining employee or somebody who has raised a concern, and doing so in the way that is consistent with how headquarters wants them to do it?
So I think it's a conversation that's a trickle down, and it's very, and I'm sure many of the companies here do it as well, is to put it on the agenda, right? And when you hear sort of the C-suite talking about it, then the level below is listening to it, and then the expectation from them, and it's a stated expectation, that they should be having the same conversation with their teams. Because, and this may be true in most cultures, but definitely we have a very large population base in India. The informal, and when I say informal, I mean like the conversations that people have with their managers is in fact the most effective way of communicating this. Yep. We can send out mailers, and you can do video messages from whoever. They're effective, but not as effective as the guy or the gal who's going to write your appraisal. Yep. And so therefore, what we have been pushing, and pushing in a big way, is to tell everybody that compliance doesn't sit and operate out of the corporate block, right? And we are asking the managers and the senior leadership to communicate that to their next level and just cascade it down. And when that cascading effect happens is, I think, when we become effective. And the cascading of the messages that if you complain, you're not going to be retaliated against. And you hear that. You hear that from employees very often. I'm raising this issue, but I'm really scared that if my manager finds out, there's going to be consequences. Yeah. And I think the other thing that you can do is when you see a manager behaving in a way that is retaliatory, even if not meeting the legal, you act swiftly. You counsel them depending on how the behavior was. And I think nothing sort of tells the tale like, reacting in a way to a situation that's bad. I think in some ways that's even more effective than what your policy says. Yep.
So Inderpreet, yeah. I think what you've touched on is fascinating, because what you've touched on to me is culture and values, right? I mean, top-down's important, and messaging from headquarters is important, and we all do it. But at the end of the day, a lot of behavior that our people engage in is going to be based on values of the organization and examples set by their local leadership and their colleagues. So if we have a small team, we're a global organization, of course, if we have a small team in Bologna, Italy, doing recruiting, day to day, it's the conduct and examples set by that local leadership, or maybe our country leadership in Italy, that's going to resonate with them much more than even the best of communications that we send out from headquarters. And our communications are great, but we're not there day to day in the way that their colleagues are.
I like that point you mentioned about it's what people see as their manager doing, because that really is the tone that you've really got to get right. We have a program called Conduct Counts, which is about setting the global standards, but we actually put our country managing directors to be in charge of the local rollout and really do that cascade, because I think we can enable them with some global stuff, all the things you were talking about, the messages, the policies, etc. But unless it's cascading at the local level, you may as well not be doing it.
Exactly right. For example, we did a session with our board. We started there, and then we took that same session and did it for our leadership. And then each of the leaders were then asked to invite the compliance team to come and speak to their leadership. And then, down the line, so on and so forth. And eventually we do put it on electronic media and people can download it. But, that's not nearly as effective as having your manager sit in a session, even if it's not like this. Even if it's an all-hands meet or a daily stand-up, and people are talking about these things. I think that's what starts making the difference. You've just got to have it on the agenda.
Joe, excuse me, Joe, I noticed you doing some nodding and making some notes. Do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the key the key to all of this is to make sure that the people who are actually closest to the transaction understand what the rules are. So, we operate in all countries except North Korea and Cuba. So, it's a lot of our workforce is people who are taking the cases and delivering them and interacting with local policemen and local government officials, and so you can have tremendously sophisticated policies and processes at the corporate headquarters, and then the division presidents or the group presidents or the business unit presidents can understand them, but you really need to get down and have everybody understand what it is that they need to do in their day-to-day job to keep ethics or integrity or compliance front of mind. So, and that doesn't just mean translating your policies into 21 languages, which we do, and having access on computers, which we do. So we just spend a lot of time, flying the wings off of planes, sending people to our locations and training. And we do just we have automated training, we have online training, but what we found the best training is to go to a location and to ask the local managers, what are the issues, or we see what issues are people getting in trouble for here, and they're a little bit unique, with different locations, and then we'll actually make localized training with local resources about, don't submit this type of a receipt versus that type of a receipt because you're going to get in trouble for that, or don't pay this person to do this. So we found you do need to get close to people, and you need to have a presence known. And we have a budget, obviously, at the Coca-Cola company we operate under, but I've told the general counsel, and he agrees, and we have tremendous support from senior management. I've never sent anyone on a trip, or I've never been on a trip where I didn't have a trail of sort of issues, questions, come back with me, or be waiting back at somebody on the team's computer or desk when they got back. So it is important to get out and just to see the people and understand what exactly how do the operations work at that level, and what they need to do, and what resources they need, or what we may need to change, right, to make sure that we can still operate the business, but we do so in a manner consistent with the high governance standards that we have.
Yeah. Absolutely. Patrick, it's, these are really great pieces of advice for a relatively consistent workforce. So let's throw M&A into the middle of the mix, right? So totally different company coming in with totally different culture and totally different policies. Obviously, Accenture has dealt with that a lot. You guys are very acquisitive as an entity. How do you think, particularly sticking with this organizational justice piece of it, how do you think about the way the folks coming in are treated, the impression they get of the compliance program, the culture at Accenture? What's your integration playbook?
So we're still learning, I think. So
we're all still learning. That's why this room's so big.
And we have been very acquisitive over the last 3 years. And I think, actually, interestingly, I think we have learned a lot from the acquisitions as well. So it's not just been, here's the almighty Accenture textbook. Now,
resistance is futile.
Yeah. You've got to follow it now. Actually, we have learnt from some of the acquisitions. So, for example, around new ways of working, or co-creation, the idea of co-creation. So it's like a word you're hearing more and more about, how to do design thinking workshops. And they have really changed us as an organization for the better. So at a practical sense, I think there are a couple of things we do. In the pre-acquisition phase, there is if you like, a cultural and organizational assessment that we do in conjunction with HR. And there we're trying to assess a number of different things, such as style of the organization, the titles they use, what's important to them. And that goes up to our M&A committee for review as one of the inputs going into that. And the next stage, once we get into acquisition, there's an assessment about prioritization, like what are you going to do right at day one, or what can wait for a little bit of time before you launch everything upon them. But you do need to be talking a lot to the individuals, because the last thing you want to do is kill the reason why you bought them in the first place.
Right.
You bought. So we've been buying a lot of advertising organizations or creative agencies, and Accenture, I think, had a reputation at one point of being like standardized robots. That's what you got. Not quite chatbots, but you got the robots. But actually, with a different type of person, they have different expectations about how they're going to work. So talking to them a lot is really important. Spending time with them, not killing them with legal process is really important. So it's all about that phasing, I think.
Yeah. Inderpreet, Richard, anything?
I was just going to add, our experience is very similar, and many times you'll hear from the design shops or from the creative thinkers that, why are you throwing this large legal document at us, and you can say the same thing in a more creative way. So,
Do you say, great, do it for us?
sorry?
Do you say, great, do it for us?
Yeah. So I think so. The idea then is that in that learning process, how do you make the communication effective, right? And it's an issue of diversity in that it's a diverse workforce with a different education background and the way they apply themselves. And so you've got to start thinking about how you communicate with that group differently because they hear and act and behave differently, right?
Absolutely.
So I'll chime in and pick up on something that Patrick said about M&A. And they really do, they have a well-oiled machine there. You've done a lot of acquisitions, robotic or otherwise. But I think even for companies that do fewer, and ManpowerGroup has done some, but we've not been extraordinarily acquisitive, absolutely, as you're looking at potential acquisition targets, in that due diligence process, there is a place, there should be a place for ethics, compliance, cultural diligence. It should live in your process on your due diligence checklist in some fashion, right? We all like to use checklists, and we're familiar with the financial due diligence, and we all look at IP and other factors. But you're buying into the culture and the history and potentially the liability of the target company. And I would say if you're not looking at these cultural values around ethics and compliance, you're potentially buying somebody who's not compatible with your organization, or worse, you're buying some liability exposure.
So I'm about to take us down a little bit of a rabbit hole on discipline calibration, but before I do that, I just wanted to pause for a second and see if anybody had anywhere else they wanted to take the panel. All right, so then I'm going to circle us all the way back to the beginning, Richard, to a point that you made about making sure that even if it doesn't necessarily look like everybody got the same results, that you wind up in a place where the company is confident that everyone is being treated fairly in the event that something goes wrong. Right. And obviously one of the things, there are a couple of factors that play into that. One is making sure that you have a good handle on the things that are happening in the first place, right? So from a process perspective, do you know about everything that's going on? And then the second piece is how do you make sure that there's a calibration of discipline across the organization and the partnerships that requires. And Patrick, I know that you talked a little bit in the prep conversation about your close working relationship with your employee relations team. So can you talk a little bit about how you guys think about discipline calibration, and then I'll pull everybody else into the conversation.
Sure. So I think HR is an essential business partner for legal in terms of the way in which we run the investigation process. Yeah. They're also a key partner for us in the way we roll out some of our conduct programs as well. They're sort of jointly owned by us and HR, focusing specifically on the investigations. So I think of myself as very much a partner with the head of employee relations. We have a merged team of investigators. Some of them come from a legal background, some of them come from an employee relations background.
And they're one co-investigation team regardless of the background they come from?
Co-investigators,
okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
They might sit in different workforces, but
yeah.
collectively we can view it as one team. And what we've been doing over the past while is actually training them about our expectations around how the investigations should be handled, recognizing that people come at it from different levels of experience and perspectives as well, talking to them about what we should be doing during the course of investigation, how we should be treating both the subject and the reporting party as well. The teams then come and present in a joint call where the investigators are also learning off each other as well, so sharing best practice and information. And then the final recommendation stage is when it comes to me and the head of employee relations, and then we make final recommendations to the general counsel and CHRO as well. But it's very much seen as a joint enterprise.
And is that on every investigation? Because I can imagine you guys must be drowning, like that's potentially based on volume, that could be a lot of touch points.
Yeah, so I'm focused here primarily on the conduct-related investigations as opposed to financial fraud or anything like that. So for these ones, if it involves a managing director in relation to any topic, that it's on this escalation path. If it involves sexual touching, it's on that escalation path. and we've sort of established some rules around that. If it's just workplace bullying or mobbing or things like that, then it's a different approach.
Richard, Enderpein, anything to
Yeah, I was just going to say, we do it slightly differently, that there are different teams that lead the investigation depending on what the issue is. So if it's an issue related to expectations of the employee and their promotions or increments, et cetera, then HR takes the lead. If it's a security incident, we'll have our CISO office take the lead, et cetera. But what we did is, so that the experience is uniform, is we actually put together, in addition to checklists, lawyers also love playbooks. So we put out an investigation playbook, and sort of setting a common denominator, if you will, as to how we expect the investigations to be conducted in a manner that's, if not uniform, there's consistency in how you handle it. And then we nuanced it for different countries, right?
Okay.
Like what you can do, can't do, what you should do and shouldn't do. And then the discipline framework, the way we apply it is, that's something that, once the outcome is determined, HR actually has it very well calibrated, and they'll put it in different buckets, and it sets out what should be the consequence management, right up to and including termination. Sometimes it could just be a chat with your manager, and many times it could be nothing. But that's how we sort of play into ensuring that you get at least a consistent experience from the employee organization.
Ours is similar. We've enhanced it over the past year, similar to Accenture. It's a partnership between legal and HR. A phrase we like to use at ManpowerGroup, possibly to excess, is fixed and flexible. That's a descriptor we like to use for a lot of our policies. There are some fixed principles, there are guardrails, but there's also, by design, there's flexibility to handle things as the circumstances might require. And what we've tried to do through these guidelines is create some of that consistency that we think is important. Important as a fairness matter, to go back to my initial comments, important in the event we're ever challenged through a legal process or otherwise, and how we've handled investigations. So to us, that feels like the right way to do it. It doesn't involve a standing permanent investigation force. It's a little bit more ad hoc, using senior people, typically in country, but again, depending on what the conduct is and whose conduct is being investigated.
Joe, anything to add to that from a process perspective?
Yeah, we've done it a couple of different ways. At one point, all investigations were done by the Ethics and Compliance Office. It was a number of years ago, and we've sort of morphed away from that. But we have a committee, an Ethics and Compliance Committee that's set up. It's co-hosted by myself and the head of our audit department. Investigations themselves are done either by the employee relations investigators. About 40% of the complaints we get over our hotline are ER-related complaints. So we act as a air traffic controller and send them to the appropriate agency. So ER does their share. If it's a legal, an anti-bribery, a sanctions issue, an environmental issue, my group, the compliance group, lawyers will investigate that. If it's a code of business conduct issue, we have a CAD group that just specializes. They have folks in 3 countries or 4 countries in those investigations. And then if it's has to do with anything of potential criminal issues, we have a security group that are all former federal agents that of one sort or another. So we have a lot of different people investigating. We do universal training, so everybody is on the same sheet of music. And then all of the issues are brought up. They get management, local management concurrence on recommendations, and then the reports and the recommendations are brought up to this Ethics and Compliance Committee, and the committee decides whether it's a violation and whether, based on the recommendation, what the punishment, if any, should be. And then those are rolled up statistically and reported to the audit committee and the general counsel and the CFO. So it's a fairly centralized system, but we feel it puts a lot of eyes on the issues, and that's it works for us. It seems there's a lot of fairness. People perceive it as being, it's not just my boss or my boss's boss that's going to figure out what happens to me or some investigator. It goes up to a group of fairly senior people who sit on this committee. We've been doing that for about 10 years, and it seems to be working well. And it does take a lot of time, but at this point, we think it's worth the time.
Oh, Patrick, you looked ripe with speech. One of the things that our survey data shows us is that in those employees who will raise their hand when they see something, somewhere between 60 and 70% by company will take it to their manager. Now, they might take it to their manager first and then continue to escalate it, right? We do definitely see creeping escalation patterns, but they are generally going to start with their manager. And that's what almost everybody's code of conduct says, which is, if you have a question, very often the right point of contact is your manager. But then you have the challenge of, depending on country, what did that manager do with that issue or concern? So as you guys think about this, particularly from an organizational justice perspective, and given the breadth of geographies that you all operate in, how do you talk to managers about, here's why we need to know what's happening in country and here's how we can partner with you? And do you have any particular geographies that you've found that to be a bigger challenge than others, and any tips in terms of how those have worked? So I'll start with you, Richard, on this one.
Oh, I was so hoping you wouldn't. This is a challenge. This is a challenge for line managers to make sure that the right processes are communicated to them, that they know what they should do if they hear about something that requires escalation. But we're committed to that, and one of the tools that we've rolled out, courtesy of our hotline vendor, is we've expanded the hotline to make sure that web-based inquiries are now available so that a manager who hears from one of his reports can go right into the same tool. So rather than relying on telephone escalation or casual email escalation, the same consistent tools available to the manager as would be to the individual reporting person. And we have found this is helpful. Do I have evidence that says all of our managers understand how to use that? No, that evidence doesn't exist. But I'm hoping with the passage of time and a better job for my team, we make that awareness better known in the organization. I do think there are parts of the world where the whole compliance hotline and what do you report to whom about people who are senior to you is a less comfortable or less reflexive act than in other parts of the world. So I don't want to generalize, but we do business in a lot of places where this would be very much going against the grain for somebody to report out their boss or their boss's boss.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's continuing the conversation, right? And I think it's a great idea that we have to sort of log into the tool, and so you can make sure that the issues are recorded. But it's, again, the communication with the managers. And then we also ask our lawyers who are in country to sort of work very closely with the leadership, and they become another source of making sure that these issues are captured. And similarly partnering with HR, because HR is oftentimes more widely present. So, often if they relate around issues, or our finance colleagues, so you leverage like a cohort, if you will, to get these issues to escalate. But we, other than, again, education, training, et cetera, we don't have a formal way of recording issues.
Patrick, do you have a winning idea?
I'm not sure I do. You just need to keep at it.
Yeah.
It's about, I said before about, in relation to our conduct program, it's about establishing the global standard and then getting the country managing directors just to keep at it, keep driving it through every level. Because there are certainly some places, and you can't generalize either, there are such wide varieties. I've found people in India very willing to stick up their hand and complain, whereas people in China would rather leave. They would rather leave than say anything at all, and then Japan or the Nordic countries are different again, so you really can't generalize. And that's why that local flavor on the messaging is just critical.
Yeah, we have two, I think, sort of secret weapons maybe, or secret ingredients, I don't know how you want to put it, but...
Secret ingredients.
One is that Ethics and Compliance Committee is 3 of the members of that committee are business unit presidents.
Okay.
from around the world. And it rotates, those particular slots rotate. So we can have the business unit president from our Mideast North Africa division or from our South Latin division, and we get great, it's a great experience. They're on it, they're making the decision, so they understand the process, and then they rotate off and go out and continue to grow their career. The second sort of force multiplier that we put in place is very similar to what you had mentioned. We formalized it, and we call it local ethics officers, or LEOs. And that gives me, I have 30-some people hard line reporting into me in the ethics and compliance group globally. This gives me 85 more individuals who dotted line report into me for matters of ethics and compliance. So it's a double hat job. It's typically the most senior lawyer in a business unit or a territory. So they've been there a long time. They understand the business. They sit on the leadership teams. They know the managers. And they have a responsibility to be local ethics officers and have certain accesses to the system, have to do certain approvals, conflict of interest, gifts and expenses, different things like that. And then we have training, and we bring them together once a year. And so it's considered from the lawyer's perspective, or some senior finance people or HR if there's not a suitable lawyer in the business unit. It's also considered sort of a special assignment, a developmental assignment, so it's a good thing to do. It's not just extra duty that you have that's really not going to be rewarded. So we use that on their performance reviews, and when we're looking out for their annual rewards, that being a Leo is actually a good thing, and we have plans sometime to extend that to the cyber, and we're going to try to come up with CLEOs, cyber local ethics officers to help with privacy.
Talk about that.
And I'd love to talk about it and how we can get the cybersecurity and the privacy piece embedded as locally as we can.
And that sort of local embedding piece is something we're seeing a lot of companies try to figure out the right mix, right? It's one thing to set up an ambassador program or a local officer program, but how do you select those people? How do you train those people? How do you prep those people? How do you track what they're doing? Those sort of infrastructure pieces are really where some of the challenge happens. We saw one company that has recently put in place a program where they're actually rotating high potential employees through the compliance and ethics team. So somebody out in the business who is doing, who's a potential regional vice president or somebody who's going to run a country comes and spends 2 years working in the compliance team on a comms initiative or an ops initiative or something like that, and then goes back out in that higher level position. And it's a deliberate part of the promotion process inside the organization, which obviously helps you transmit the culture message. Now, you can't do that with 100 people at a time, depending on the size of your team. But it is a way of getting that piece of the performance evaluation process as a part of the dialogue. It's and Joe, you. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of companies do right now is try to get their arms around how people feel about how the process went, right? So I know the panel yesterday on workplace investigations talked about post-investigation follow-up with known reporters and witnesses and things like that. But again, that requires it to get into the system for investigation in order for you to be able to do that follow-up work. So, one of the things that we're seeing companies do is for employees that have raised something with their manager, asking how they felt about how that process went. And then saying, this is a measure of the manager to say, if 40% of employees felt like the process went well, that's not nearly as good as 80% of employees feeling that the process went well. And how do we get from 40 to 80? Tracking things like turnover rates by manager. You mentioned, people in China would rather leave. Patrick, you mentioned people in China would rather leave than complain about their manager. Are there particular metrics that you guys are tracking on this organizational justice piece that you would recommend to the folks in the room to think about?
So we have our, everybody does them, I'm sure, their engagement surveys.
Yep.
Ours is particularly focused around conduct. And one of the questions, the series of questions we ask are, did you experience a certain type of behavior if you experienced that behaviour, did you feel that you could speak up about it? If you did speak up about it, what happened? Did you see negative or positive action as a result of that? How did the person you reported it to behave? What did they do as well? Did they do the right thing? So you can actually see and track over the period of time, whether the messages are cascading in the right way.
And we do the same thing, and we track the responses based on seniority, based on geography, based on other factors. So that possibly identifies areas or places where we might need to redouble our efforts, or where there might be some organizational weakness. Again, this is data-driven. Shouldn't be that hard if you're doing a global survey or a company-wide survey to drill deeper into the data and see if there are any patterns that emerge.
And then are there any other, turnover metrics? Do you guys cross those results with anything else?
We do some of that. I'm not sure we're as evolved as we might be, and we're probably less evolved in the post-investigation process.
Oh, you've lost your mic.
What I think I was saying is that we cross-tabulate a lot of our, we call it a MAPS, Manpower Annual People Survey, right? So we have our own acronyms, but we cross-tabulate a lot of our MAPS results with geography, with level within the organization, with some other factors, so that we can look for patterns that either indicate an area of concern or an area or group of people where perhaps additional education or reinforcement is necessary. And it also tells us whether the message is perceived the same way around speaking up, around anti-retaliation among our more junior people. Of course, in the C-suite, we're all convinced, right? We get it. But where the rubber meets the road is with our employee base, and do they understand how it works and what's expected of them? And so we do that data analysis for exactly that reason.
Yeah, similar. I think it's a lot of it's part of the employee survey analysis, but we're not doing. I think we could possibly do more. So I've made some notes.
We call it the layering of control data. So, Patrick.
We're actually starting to do an experiment. I'm looking across the room at the person who'll be leading that experiment to think more about how we can use analytics to actually capture all these different data sets, whether it's attrition data, the survey data, the investigations data, time and expense reporting, to really just try and pick up, are there hotspots? We are not there yet, but we've got elements of it, but we really need to knit it all together.
Anything to add to that, Joe?
We created actually a little data team just to do this. It's about 3 or 4 people, and we've gotten new systems, and we're trying to figure out how we can tap into, because every company has a lot of data, and like expense reporting, all of it. So we're trying to figure out how we can tap into that data and then put it with our database of investigations and violations, and we have 15 years worth of that, and be more predictive. And also, is there a hot spot over here with this particular type of violation, which could indicate more training is needed, or if you have 4 people who are violate a particular part of the code of business conduct in one location, well, that's one thing. But if they all report to the same manager, maybe you want to take a look at the manager, right? Or maybe the manager needs to be trained, or maybe so we're trying to, there's a lot of opportunity, and we're trying to figure out how is the best way to use the data and work with the business to give them the information that they need, also to, again, make sure we have appropriate training and applying our resources in the most efficient way.
Thank you. So the timer down here has gone yellow on me, which means we just have a couple of minutes if anybody in the room has a question for the panel. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about
Hold on, we're bringing you a mic. And then we'll come to you, sir.
Thank you. This question is for Richard. With regards to the manager being able to go into the tool and put in what the employee reported to him or her, is there any problem, or do you have to navigate around if the employee didn't go to the hotline in the first place and the manager then puts it into the hotline? Is there any concern with that, and is there any communication that goes out to the employee with regards to that?
No, under our code of conduct, we consider bringing something to the attention of your manager to be an acceptable, in some cases even an encouraged alternative to using the hotline. And this is, our ultimate goal, of course, is to make sure that things that should be escalated do get escalated. And we've been pleased with the expansion that allows the manager to input the same information. I think in practice this would be done with the knowledge of the reporting person who comes to him or her. This is not meant to be a cloak and dagger type thing. It's just an alternative to the reporting mechanisms. Right. Almost by definition, this starts out when an employee goes to his manager or her manager and says, I have a concern, there's something I saw.
Great. We have one more question.
This question, Richard, is for you as well. You mentioned in your opening dialogue the perception of a fair disciplinary process. My role in my organization in the Corporate Office of Business Conduct is more of an oversight capacity. If we get a complaint, let's say through our ethics hotline, we refer it over to the investigative body, and they'll report their findings back to us. And very, very frequently, our viewpoint is aligned with their final disposition based on the findings, but very, very seldom, but it does occur. We may have a viewpoint of, well, this should have concluded, let's say, at level C, whereas you're only arriving at level A, and then a debate opens up as to, where this lands, and that gets to the heart of the perception of discipline. So I was wondering if you had anything similar that you could perhaps comment on.
Well, one thought or observation, and hopefully this answers your question. We may not be in the same place as some other companies are about radical transparency around processes or concerning investigations. We may get there. We're not there yet for many reasons. And to me, that shouldn't be unusual. I mean, we hear discussion about a very open process. But when I step back, there are lots and lots of things going on at the company that employees do not and would not normally expect to be kept apprised of on an ongoing basis. M&A transactions, we don't share those with the employee base until there's a deal that needs to be announced. Succession and leadership changes, we're not an open door on those. Again, when there's something that needs to be disclosed, including for regulatory reasons, we disclose it. So it's interesting that the idea of an investigatory process, in some people's opinion, requires a much different level of transparency. And at least for me and my company, we're not at that point. But since we're not at that point, we do hopefully have an environment in the company where employees, whether it's an investigation concerning them or something that they sense may be going on, where they feel confident that the company is handling it in a way which would be fair and appropriate, even if they don't know the details around it. So I think we in some ways, it's a trust we have for our employees to perceive that the company is going to handle things sensitively and appropriately.
Any final thoughts to add to that from, okay, and the red light is blinking at us very dramatically. So please join me, everybody, in thanking our final panel.